Orville Rourke had told his two sons on more occasions than either of them could count that no woman alive possessed the particular combination of patience, fire, and stubborn persistence required to get under his skin, and he had said it with such absolute conviction that both boys had long since stopped arguing the point, which was why neither of them had the heart to tell him. When the stagecoach rolled into Redemption Creek on that dusty Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, that the woman stepping down from it looked like exactly the kind of trouble their father had spent 52 years of his life insisting did not exist. The town of Redemption Creek sat at the edge of the high plains in the Texas Panhandle, a place of hard red dirt and relentless wind, and skies so wide they made a man feel small and grateful all at once. It was a working town, not a pretty one. There was a general store run by a German immigrant named Bauer who kept meticulous records and an equally meticulous distrust of credit. There was a saloon called the Lucky Spur that smelled of sawdust and tobacco, and the particular kind of loneliness that accumulates in places where men spend too much time alone. There was a church that the reverend kept immaculately clean on the outside and largely empty on the inside. And there was a livery stable and a post office, and a small doctor's office that doubled as a dentist's chair on Thursdays. The railroad had bypassed Redemption Creek by 12 miles, which some said was the death of the town and others said was its salvation, and the argument had been running for 3 years without resolution. The Rourke Ranch, called the Double R by anyone in the county who had business with it, and called considerably less flattering things by the ranchers who competed with it, sat 7 miles north of town, sprawling across 4,000 acres of grassland that Orville Rourke had built from nothing over the course of 23 years. He had come to the Texas Panhandle as a young man of 29 with $140, a strong back, and a capacity for silence that people sometimes mistook for stupidity, and always eventually learned to respect. He had bought his first 50 acres from a man who wanted to go to California and never looked back, and then he had worked that land with a ferocity that bordered on devotion, and then he had bought more land, and then he had raised cattle, and then he had raised 2 sons, and somewhere in the doing of all those things his wife had died of fever when the boys were young, and Orville had grieved her in private and then gotten back to work, and that had been 21 years ago. And he had not permitted himself to think seriously about another woman since. His older son was named Clement, who was 26 and built like his father, broad across the shoulders and narrow in the hips, with a quiet, steady way of moving through the world that made horses and dogs trust him immediately. His younger son was named Dax, who was 23, and had inherited whatever lightness and humor existed somewhere back in the Rourke bloodline, because he certainly had not gotten it from Orville. Dax was the one who had ridden into town that Tuesday morning to collect supplies and a package from the post office, and Dax was the one who saw the stagecoach pull in, and Dax was the one who watched the woman step down from it, and felt the particular sensation of witnessing something that is going to change everything before you can do anything about it. She was not what anyone in Redemption Creek would have expected from a woman arriving alone on the stage. She was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark auburn hair that she had pinned up practically under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days, but was still defiant in its posture. She was slender but not delicate, with strong hands and a direct, unsentimental gaze that swept the main street of Redemption Creek with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned to assess a situation quickly and act on what she finds. She wore a sensible traveling dress of brown wool that was dusty from the road, and she carried one large trunk and a leather satchel that she refused to let the driver handle, shouldering it herself with the ease of long practice. Dax watched her from the rail outside the general store and felt something shift in him, a kind of recognition that was strange because he had never seen her before in his life. She looked up the street and then down it, and then she walked directly into the general store with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what she needs, and Dax, after a moment of consideration, followed her in. Bauer was behind the counter, regarding her with the cautious curiosity he reserved for all newcomers. "I am looking for the Rourke Ranch," she said, and her voice was clear and slightly husky, with a cadence that suggested she had spent time in more than one part of the country. "Can you tell me who I need to speak to about getting there?" Bauer blinked. "The double R." "That is what the advertisement said," she replied, and she set her satchel on the counter and unfastened it and produced a folded piece of newspaper that she smoothed flat with one hand. "Cook and housekeeper wanted, room and board provided, wages negotiable, apply in person. Double R Ranch, Redemption Creek, Texas. Signed, Rourke." She looked up at Bauer. "That is the right ranch." Dax had gone very still in the doorway. Bauer said, "Yes, ma'am, that is the Rourke place," and then he looked at Dax with an expression that contained a very specific kind of amusement. Dax cleared his throat. "I am Dax Rourke," he said. She turned and looked at him with those direct, level eyes. "Then I suppose you are the person I need to speak to. My name is Maggie Keene. I have come about the position." Dax smiled slowly. "Yes," he said, "I can see that. The thing is, Miss Keene, the advertisement was my brother's idea, and he may or may not have remembered to mention it to our father." She regarded him for a moment. "Is that a polite way of telling me the position may not exist?" "It is a polite way of telling you," Dax said carefully, "that you are welcome to ride out to the ranch with me and find out." Maggie Keene considered this for exactly 3 seconds, then fastened her satchel, picked it up, and said, "All right." The drive out to the double R took the better part of an hour in the wagon, and Dax Rourke talked most of the way, which was his natural tendency, and Maggie Keene listened and asked occasional precise questions, which was hers. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle operation, about the fact that they had been without a proper cook since their last housekeeper had married a farmer in Abilene and gone north 3 months ago, and that since then they had been eating whatever Clement could manage, which was not inspiring. "Your brother cooked?" Maggie asked. "He tries," Dax said charitably. "What he actually does is heat things until they stop looking like what they started as." Maggie permitted herself a small smile. "And your father?" Dax glanced at her sideways. "Our father is not what you would call a domestic man," he said. "He ranches, that is what he does. He has been doing it since before either of us were born, and I expect he will be doing it when we are all gone. He is not, I should probably tell you, expecting you." "You said that." "I am saying it again because I want you to be prepared." She looked at him with those steady eyes. "I have worked as a cook and housekeeper in 4 different households in the last 8 years, Mr. Rourke. I spent 2 of those years at a mining camp outside Denver, where the men thought manners were a kind of disease. I think I can manage 1 rancher." Dax Rourke nearly said something, thought better of it, and turned back to the road. He was beginning to think that Clement's spontaneous newspaper advertisement, which Orville Rourke definitely did not know about and definitely had not authorized, was going to be either the best or most catastrophic thing either of his sons had ever done. He could not yet determine which. The double R came into view around a long bend in the trail, and even Maggie, who was not given to exclamation, drew a quiet breath at the sight of it. The main house was a substantial 2-story structure of stone and timber that Orville had built with his own hands over a period of 4 years, adding to it as the ranch grew and his means expanded. It was not a fine house in any decorative sense, but it was solidly, beautifully made, the kind of building that speaks of genuine craftsmanship and an intention to last. There were outbuildings arranged around it with clear practical logic, a barn of considerable size, a bunkhouse for the hands, a smokehouse, a water tower, corrals with good fencing, and everywhere the evidence of a land well managed and purposefully worked. Orville Rourke was standing at the corral fence when they pulled in, and he turned at the sound of the wagon with the unhurried attention of a man who is used to observing things before he responds to them. He was not a handsome man in any conventional portrait painter sense, but he was a striking one. He was big, not in the exaggerated way of a man who lifts things for show, but in the solid, functional way of a man who has spent decades doing physical work in all weathers. His hair had gone almost entirely silver, and his face was deeply weathered, with lines that had been put there by sun and wind and things he had carried privately for a long time. His eyes were a pale, startling gray, the color of the sky before a serious storm, and they were currently fixed on the wagon with an expression that was transitioning from neutral to something considerably more complicated. He came away from the fence as Dax pulled the wagon to a stop. "Clement send for something?" he asked, looking at Maggie with the careful blankness of a man who has not yet decided what he thinks. "No, sir," Dax said, and he had the decency to look slightly abashed. "This is Miss Maggie Keene. She has come about the advertisement." Orville looked at his son with the measured patience of a man who has a great deal of experience with situations his children have created without informing him. "The advertisement," he said. "The one Clement placed in the San Antonio paper," Dax said, "for a cook and housekeeper." "Clement placed an advertisement in the San Antonio paper." "Yes, sir, without consulting me." "That appears to be correct." Orville was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Maggie Keene, who was looking back at him with a composure that acknowledged the awkwardness of the situation without being embarrassed by it. There was something in her gaze that was neither challenging nor deferential, simply present and clear-eyed, and it arrested his attention in a way he did not immediately have words for. "Miss Keene," he said, and his voice was a deep, unhurried sound, like the low register of something that does not waste itself on noise. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "you came all the way from San Antonio on the strength of a newspaper advertisement." "I came from Wichita," she corrected, without heat. "I saw the advertisement there. I was finishing a previous engagement and looking for a new position. The terms described seemed fair, and the location presented an opportunity I was interested in." "What opportunity?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "Running a household that actually requires running," she said. "I have spent the last year as a cook for a banking family in Wichita who employed 4 other staff and had very little need of actual work from any of us. I prefer to be useful." Orville looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Dax. "Where is Clement?" "Probably out on the South Range," Dax said. "He was checking the fence line on the creek." "Go get him," Orville said. Dax went without argument, which told Maggie something about the weight that man's voice carried in this place. Orville turned back to her. "I did not authorize an advertisement," he said. "Oh, the position may or may not be available, and I apologize if you have traveled this far on a misunderstanding." "I appreciate the honesty," Maggie said. She looked around at the ranch yard, at the house, at the organized, purposeful arrangement of everything around her, and then back at him. "Though I will say that from the look of this place, someone needs to be cooking and keeping house here, and it would be a shame to send me back on the stage without at least letting me demonstrate that I can do it well." He regarded her with that still, measuring gaze. "You are not shy about your own capabilities." "I have found that shyness about one's capabilities tends to result in being underpaid and underestimated," she said. "I prefer to be direct. You can tell me to go back to town and I will go, or you can let me make supper tonight and we can discuss the terms in the morning." Orville Rourke, who had told his sons on 17 separate occasions that he would never permit a woman to run his household, because it always ended with either complications or codependency, looked at Maggie Keene standing in his ranch yard with her dusty hat and her leather satchel and her perfectly level gray-green eyes, and felt the very specific, very inconvenient sensation of a man whose certainty has just developed a crack. "The kitchen is through the back of the house," he said. "Dax will show you where things are." Clement arrived back from the South Range just before sundown, and the expression on his face when he came through the kitchen door, and found a woman stirring a pot of venison stew that smelled better than anything that had come out of that kitchen in 3 months, was one of pure, uncomplicated relief, followed almost immediately by a flinch of apprehension, as he realized his father would be sitting down to supper with the consequences of an advertisement he had placed without permission. "She seems capable," was all Orville said, when Clement arrived at the table still dusty from the range. He said it in the tone of a man who is choosing his words with some care. "She is extraordinary," Dax said, with considerably less care, gesturing at the stew and the fresh cornbread and the jar of preserved peaches she had found in the cellar, and arranged on the table with the practical elegance of someone who understands that a meal should nourish the spirit as well as the body. Maggie herself ate with them, because there was no other place to eat and no reason not to, and she held her end of the supper conversation with quiet competence, asking reasonable questions about the ranch's operation, learning the rhythm of the days and the demands of the different seasons, taking information in and filing it with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. Orville said very little, but he ate 2 full bowls of the stew and 3 pieces of cornbread, which Dax noticed and stored away with private satisfaction. After supper, Orville told Maggie that she could have the spare room at the end of the upstairs hall, and they would discuss the formal arrangement in the morning. He said it in a way that suggested the discussion was largely a formality, and Maggie understood this and thanked him simply and went upstairs, and Orville sat at the table for a long time after she had gone, drinking his coffee and not saying anything, and the boys had the good sense to leave him to it. She had been at the Double R for 4 days before Orville Rourke had a complete conversation with her that was not about the running of the ranch. It happened on Friday evening, after supper had been cleared and Clement and Dax had gone out to check on a mare that was close to foaling. Orville was on the porch with his pipe, looking out at the dark bulk of the plains under a sky that was so crowded with stars it seemed almost excessive, and Maggie came out the front door with a cup of coffee for herself and stopped when she saw him and said, "I am sorry, I did not know you were out here. I can go inside." "You can sit if you want," he said, and the offer surprised them both slightly. She sat in the other chair, the one that had always been empty, and they were quiet together for a few minutes, which was not uncomfortable. The night was full of sound out here, crickets and the distant lowing of cattle and the wind in the dry grass that never entirely stopped, and the quiet between 2 people is a very different thing from silence. "Where did you learn to cook?" he asked after a while. "My mother," she said. "She ran a boarding house in Missouri. I helped her from the time I was big enough to reach the stove. We had 12 men at the table most nights and a budget that required creative thinking." "Missouri," he said, "near Hannibal. My father died when I was 9. My mother kept us going on her own. She was a remarkable woman." "Was," he said. "She passed 2 years ago," Maggie said, and there was no self-pity in it, just the plain fact of loss stated clearly. "After that I had no particular reason to stay and several reasons to go." Orville was quiet. He understood something about the kind of loss that sets a person loose in the world, that removes the anchor of a particular place and leaves you finding your way by different stars. "The mining camp," he said. "You mentioned Denver." "Colorado, yes. Before that I was in Missouri, then Kansas." "The mining camp was hard work but honest work, and the men were rough but most of them were decent enough when they were sober." She paused. "It was there that I learned a great deal about how to make very little go a very long way, and how to handle the ones who weren't decent when they needed handling." He looked at her sideways. "How did you handle them?" She met his gaze with a composed directness that he was beginning to recognize as her natural state. "I made it clear that my presence in the camp was a professional arrangement, and that my person was not part of the terms, and I said it in a way that left very little room for misunderstanding. And that worked." "Most of the time," she said. "I also learned to be a reasonably good shot with a pistol, which helped with the exceptions." Orville made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost, and it surprised him enough that he looked away and took a draw on his pipe to cover it. They sat on the porch for another half-hour, talking in the way that people talk when they are feeling out the shape of each other's minds, trading information carefully and attending to what comes back. Maggie learned that Orville had come from Kentucky as a young man, that he had spent 2 years as a drover on the cattle trails before he had saved enough to buy land, that he had built every structure on the Double R with his own hands and those of the men he had hired over the years, and that he felt about this land the way some people feel about family, not sentimental about it, but deeply, fundamentally attached to it. In the way that one is attached to the things that have given one's life its shape and meaning. Orville learned that Maggie Keene had been offered marriage twice and had declined both times, not from any particular aversion to the institution, but because neither offer had felt like the right thing at the right moment, and she was not the kind of woman who would settle for the wrong thing simply because it was available. He absorbed this information without reaction, but it stayed with him. When Clement came back from the barn to report that the mare had delivered a healthy colt, Maggie excused herself and went in, and Orville sat on the porch a while longer than he usually did, which was not something he examined too closely. The weeks that followed moved in the rhythm of ranch life, which is a rhythm governed by the land and the animals and the weather and the inexorable turning of the season, and within that rhythm, Maggie Keene inserted herself with a competence and a quietness that was, in its own way, a kind of artistry. She understood that a household is not a decorative thing but a functional one, and that the people it sustains perform better when they are properly fed and have clean clothes and sleep in rooms that are reasonably ordered and comfortable. She did not try to make the Double R into something it was not, but she made it work the way it was supposed to work, and the difference it made to the men who lived and worked there was palpable within the first 2 weeks. She also, gradually, without apparent design, began to make it a home. It was small things, mostly. A jar of wildflowers on the table in the spring, because she had ridden out to check the creek and found them growing along the bank and brought a handful back. Fresh curtains in the kitchen, made from a bolt of blue cotton she had bought at Bowers with her own wages, because the ones there had been rotted at the edges by sun and would not hang properly. She organized the kitchen with a logic that the Rourke men found self-evident in hindsight but had never thought to implement themselves, and she kept the storeroom in a state of careful inventory so that nothing ran out unexpectedly, which had apparently been a recurring problem. She also began, without making any particular announcement about it, to assist with things outside the house. This started practically enough when Clement came back one afternoon with a cut on his arm from a fence wire that needed cleaning and dressing, and Maggie did it efficiently and without fuss, and demonstrated a knowledge of wound care that suggested she had spent a great deal of time around situations that produced injuries. When he asked, she told him that the mining camp had been 30 miles from the nearest doctor, and that she had learned what she needed to learn. After that it became understood that Maggie was the person to see about medical things, and she kept a small kit of bandages and salves, and the various herbs and remedies she had accumulated over years of practical experience. She also turned out to be genuinely useful in the garden plot behind the house, which had been neglected for years, and which she began to rehabilitate with the same methodical determination she applied to everything else. Orville came around the corner of the house one morning and found her on her knees in the dirt, working compost into the soil with her hands, her hair coming loose from its pins and a streak of mud on her cheek, and something moved in his chest in a way that was not entirely welcome and entirely impossible to ignore. "That is going to be a lot of work," he said, meaning the garden. "Yes," she said, not looking up. "Most worthwhile things are." He stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he went back to what he had been doing, which was considerably less interesting than what he had just been watching, and he knew it, and did not like the knowing. It was at this point, around 5 weeks after Maggie's arrival, that Dax and Clement had a quiet conversation in the barn that they would never have had if they had thought their father could hear it, though as it turned out he was not particularly far away, working on a piece of tack in the adjacent stall with a stillness that horses, and apparently, his sons had learned to overlook. He likes her, Dax said with the particular certainty of a young man who has been watching his father carefully. He respects her, Clement said more cautiously. That is how it starts with him. He respected Mama before he loved her. That is what he said once. He said he had never known another person he respected more, and that the loving followed from it like water following a slope. Clement was quiet for a moment. She does not seem like a woman who is looking to be married, he said. She is too independent for it. Independent women get married all the time, Dax said. They just need to find men who are not diminished by their independence. And she seems to me like a woman who could stand a man like Pa, Clement said, has told us approximately 1,000 times that no woman is going to tame him. Nobody is trying to tame him, Dax said. And I do not think Maggie Keene is in the business of taming anything. She just is what she is, and it is something he has not encountered before. In the adjacent stall, Orville Rourke finished the piece of tack he was working on with particular care, and then sat very still for a while, which was something he was good at, and which the particular turmoil currently occupying his chest did not make any easier. He had told his sons that no woman would ever tame him. He had meant it when he said it, and he believed it still, though perhaps the word tame was not quite the right frame for what was happening to him, which was something altogether more complicated and less controllable than he wanted to examine. He was not being tamed. That was not the right word for the sensation of finding himself alert to a particular person's presence in a way that sharpened everything around him. The way an unfamiliar sound in the night will sharpen all your senses at once. He was being, if he was honest with himself, noticed by himself. He had been going through the motions of his life for 21 years with a competence and a purpose that he was proud of and that had produced something real and lasting, and it had not occurred to him until recently that there was a dimension of living that had gone unfed in all that time. He had thought the hunger for it had simply died. He was being instructed, gently and entirely without intent on her part, that it had not. The occasion on which things changed between them, not all at once, because nothing changes all at once in the real world, but in the way that a conversation can shift the light on something you have been looking at for weeks and suddenly let you see it differently, was a Thursday evening in June, when a thunderstorm rolled in from the west with the particular violence that the Texas Panhandle specializes in. A wall of cloud that turned the sky green-black and sent the wind howling before it, and then descended on the double R with a ferocity that rattled the windows and set the cattle bawling in the far pasture. The boys were out trying to get the cattle to shelter before the lightning started in earnest, and Orville was on the porch watching the storm come, assessing it with the practical eye of a man who has had his land damaged by weather before and knows how to read the sky's intentions. The rain hit hard and immediate, the kind of rain that soaks you through in 30 seconds and turns the yard to mud, and behind him the door opened and Maggie came out with his oilskin coat, which he had forgotten in the barn that morning, and held it out to him. He turned and took it from her, and in the doing of it their hands overlapped briefly, the coat between them, and neither of them moved away immediately. And the rain roared around the porch and the lightning cracked somewhere close and illuminated the yard in a white flash, and they were standing very close together in the thunder of it. And Orville Rourke looked at Maggie Keene in the storm light and felt something he had been successfully not feeling for 5 weeks arrive with the inevitability of weather. "Thank you," he said, "for the coat." "You looked cold," she said, which was not quite accurate because the rain was warm and they both knew it. He put the coat on, and they stood on the porch and watched the storm move over the land, and it was the most comfortable he had felt in the presence of another person in a very long time, and he recognized that fact with the wary precision of a man who understands the danger of comfort. When the boys came back in, soaked and exhilarated, Maggie had hot coffee and dry towels waiting, and Orville found himself watching the easy way she moved in his house, in the house he had built, tending to his sons, and the feeling was so particular and so specific that he had to go to his room and stand at the window for a while before he could account for himself properly. The town of Redemption Creek had opinions about Maggie Keene's presence at the Double R within approximately 8 days of her arrival, because small towns in the Texas Panhandle in 1878 had opinions about everything and generated them quickly. Some of the opinions were kind, some were curious, and some were the particular brand of small-town speculation that involves people filling in gaps in their knowledge with the most interesting narrative available. Orville dealt with this in town the following Saturday with a brevity that closed the subject like a door. He was at the general store when Sam Hilliard, who ran the feed and grain and had a weakness for other people's business, said something that managed to question Maggie's situation on the ranch while pretending to be a simple inquiry. And Orville looked at him with those pale storm-gray eyes for a moment, and then said that Miss Keene was the housekeeper and cook for the Double R, and was an excellent one, and that her reputation and her position were clear, and he would thank people to treat her accordingly. And the flatness and the finality in his voice were such that Sam Hilliard found several pressing reasons to be elsewhere, and the conversation in the general store moved to other things. Maggie did not know about this for several weeks, and when Dax told her, she went quiet for a moment and then said, "He did not have to do that." "No," Dax agreed. "He did not." She was quiet a moment longer. "He is a good man," she said, and the way she said it was not a discovery but a confirmation, as though she had known it for a while and was only now saying it aloud. It was in July that the fence trouble started. A man named Harlan Briggs had been trying to acquire grazing rights on a section of creek frontage that had historically been the Double R's territory, and the new wire fencing that Orville had put in 2 springs ago had made the territorial question formal and legal in a way that Harlan Briggs did not appreciate. He was not a bad man exactly, but he was a man accustomed to the old way of doing things, when boundaries were suggestions, and a man's reach was largely determined by how far he was willing to push. And the Homestead Act and the new fence lines had created a rigidity that men like Briggs chafed against. The fence trouble was not violent. There were cut wires and a displaced post or two, the kind of harassment that falls short of confrontation but sends a message, and Orville handled it with the methodical calm he brought to everything, repairing what was damaged and increasing his attention to the affected sections without escalating the situation beyond what it required. What Maggie did was different. She had ridden out with Clement on a supply run to the south pasture and seen the cut wire for herself, and when she got back, she found the land records that Orville kept in the locked drawer of his desk. She had found the key by the simple method of asking him if she could clean the desk, and he had told her where the key was, which said something about his trust in her, and she spread them out on the kitchen table that evening and went through them carefully. Because she had kept accounts for the boarding house from the age of 12, and she understood documents. When Orville came in, she was at the table with his land papers arranged before her and a piece of paper on which she had made notes in her neat, clear hand. "The filing date on the southeast section," she said, without preamble. "The one with the creek frontage. Is there a corresponding record at the county courthouse in Amarillo?" He sat down across from her. "There should be. I filed everything properly in '72. "Then you should have a certified copy made and kept somewhere other than this house," she said. "If the record exists in Amarillo, you have a legal foundation that no amount of cut fence wire can undermine. The problem is that a legal foundation only helps you if you can produce it, get it certified and kept with the lawyer in Redemption Creek." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know about land law. I know that property disputes in Kansas were common enough that my mother spent 3 years fighting for the boarding house after my father died, because his name was on the deed and she had to prove entitlement," Maggie said. "I paid attention." He took the paper she had made notes on and read it. His expression did not change in any obvious way, but there was a quality of attention in his face that she had learned to recognize as his version of being moved. "I will ride to Amarillo next week," he said. "You could send Clement," she suggested. "I will go myself," he said. "Some things require a man to attend to them in person." He looked at her across the table, the lamp between them, the documents spread out, the evening quiet around them, and said, "Thank you, Maggie." And it was the first time he had used her given name, and they both knew it, and neither of them addressed it directly. But the air between them was different after, in the way that air is different after lightning has moved through it. He rode to Amarillo. He was gone for 4 days. Maggie ran the household and fed the hands and assisted Clement with the inventory of the North Pasture's cattle numbers, and generally carried on as she always did. But she noticed his absence with a specificity that told her something she had been trying not to know. When he came back on a Thursday afternoon, she was in the garden, and she heard the horse in the yard and stood up and looked over the fence, and he was dismounting, and Dax was coming out of the barn to take the horse. And Orville looked over and saw her standing there in the garden with dirt on her hands and her hair loose from its pins in the heat, and he stopped for a moment. Just a moment. Then he lifted one hand in acknowledgement and went into the house, and Maggie turned back to her garden and stayed there until her heart had settled to something like its usual pace. That evening he brought her a small package, flat and wrapped in brown paper. She opened it at the kitchen table and found it was a book, a copy of Middlemarch by George Eliot, which had been published 8 years earlier and which she had not read but had wanted to for a long time. "How did you know?" she asked. "Dax told me you had been borrowing Clement's books," he said. "He said you had read everything in the house twice. I thought I saw it in Amarillo." She held the book in both hands and looked at him with an expression that was too full and too complex for the simple occasion of a gift, and he looked back at her with the careful blankness that she knew now was not blankness at all but attention so concentrated it made him still. "Thank you," she said. "Truly." "It is nothing," he said, which was not true, and they both knew it was not true. Dax, who had contrived to be in the kitchen during this exchange on the entirely transparent pretext of getting a glass of water, took his water and went out very quickly, and then leaned against the side of the house in the evening air and grinned at the sky with the particular satisfaction of a man who can see where things are going. It was Clement, more reserved by nature, who raised the practical concern with Dax the following morning. "What happens," he said, "if Pa actually falls for her and she leaves?" Dax looked at his brother. "Why would she leave?" "Because she is an independent woman with skills that could take her anywhere," Clement said. "She is not stuck here. She could go to any city in the country, Denver, St. Louis, anywhere. Why would she stay in the Texas Panhandle?" Dax was quiet for a moment. "Maybe because of the same reason Pa stayed," he said. "Because something here feels like the place you are supposed to be." Clement looked out at the land. "You think she feels that?" "I think," Dax said carefully, "that she feels something." What Maggie felt, if she had been asked to describe it with the directness she brought to most things, was a growing and inconvenient certainty that Orville Rourke was the most interesting man she had ever spent sustained time with. He was not easy. He was reserved in ways that required patience to read and silences, that required a certain confidence to sit with without filling. He had opinions that he held with a calm conviction that was different from stubbornness in the way that a stone is different from a wall. A stone simply is what it is, without apology and without aggression. He was completely without artifice, which she found extraordinary, because nearly every person she had ever known was performing some version of themselves to some degree, and he was not. What you saw was what was there, and what was there was substantial. He was also, she had discovered over weeks of living in close proximity, quietly and consistently kind in ways that he did not call attention to. He paid the ranch hands fairly and treated them with a respect that was not common among ranchers of his standing. He checked on the horses at night when it was cold. He had, she had learned from Dax, been sending money to the family of a hand who had been injured on the ranch the previous year, until the man recovered enough to work again. He had done this without any mention of it, and would have gone on not mentioning it if Dax had not told her by accident. She was thinking about all of this one evening in late July when she was sitting on the porch reading her book. She was two-thirds through it, and it was everything she had hoped, when Orville came and sat in the other chair, which he had been doing with increasing frequency since that first time after the thunderstorm. And he had his pipe and she had her book, and the evening was the color of copper at the edges, and the cattle were quiet in the far pasture. "What do you want from your life, Maggie?" he asked, after a while. It was a direct question, and she appreciated it because she was a direct person. She set her book in her lap and considered it genuinely. "I want to be useful," she said. "I want a home that is mine. She paused. "I want to be somewhere that I am glad to be, with people I am glad to know." He was quiet. The pipe smoke drifted. "And this place?" he asked. "This is the first place I have been in a long time," she said carefully, "where I wake up in the morning looking forward to what the day will hold." He turned and looked at her then, and there was nothing measured about it, no careful calculation of how much to show. He just looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the moment had a weight and a texture that neither of them could have described, but both of them felt precisely. "I am glad you came," he said. "I did not expect it. I was not." He stopped. He was a man who chose his words with care because he meant every one he used, and this required thought. "I had arrived at a settled opinion about my life, what it contained and what it did not. You have made me question that opinion." She was very still. "And do you mind that?" He considered the question with honest seriousness. "I minded it at first," he said. "I do not mind it now." The silence that followed was the best kind, the kind that has something living in it. It was 2 weeks after this conversation that Harlan Briggs made a more overt move, and it was this that decided something for Orville in a way that all the evenings on the porch and the book and the thunderstorm had been moving toward without his full acknowledgement. Briggs sent 3 of his men to tear out a quarter-mile of fence on the southeast section, the creek frontage, on a Saturday morning, when most of the Double R hands were in town and Orville and Clement were working the North Range. Maggie was at the house when one of the younger ranch hands, a 17-year-old boy named Pete, came riding in fast to say the Briggs men were at the fence, and he was scared and looking for instruction. Maggie made a decision in approximately 3 seconds. She told Pete to ride hard to the North Range and find Orville and Clement and bring them to the south fence. Then she saddled her own horse. She had been riding since childhood and she rode well, and she rode out to the southeast section herself, not to confront the Briggs men but to be a witness. She knew enough law from her mother's land battle to know that a dispute witnessed and documented was different from one that came down to competing claims afterward. When she arrived, there were 3 Briggs men pulling out fence posts with a mechanical efficiency that spoke of planning. She did not approach them. She positioned herself at a distance and watched, and she had brought with her a small journal and a pencil, and she wrote down what she saw and the approximate time with methodical precision. One of the Briggs men noticed her and rode over. He was a large, unpleasant man with a manner that was designed to be intimidating. "You got no business here, ma'am," he said. "I am on Double R land," she said, "which I believe is still Double R land regardless of what your employer thinks. I am simply observing." She made a point of writing something in her journal. He looked at her journal and then back at her face, and she returned his gaze with that level, unflinching directness that she possessed as naturally as other people possess height or blue eyes, and something in her manner made him decide not to push further. He rode back to the others. Orville arrived 20 minutes later with Clement and Pete and 2 other hands, and when he saw Maggie sitting her horse at a distance from the Briggs men with her journal in her hand, he felt something move through him that he recognized afterward as having been the decisive thing, a great, specific, uncomplicated admiration that was the last piece of something that had been building for months. The confrontation with the Briggs men was brief and controlled. Orville was not a man who raised his voice to make a point, and he did not raise it now. He informed them that they were on Double R land with documented title, that the specific land records had been certified in Amarillo 2 weeks previous, that the destruction of his fence constituted criminal damage under Texas law, and that he intended to pursue the matter through the county sheriff, and through the courts if necessary, and that they could relay all of this to Harlan Briggs at their earliest convenience. He said all of it quietly and completely without theatrical emphasis, and the Briggs men looked at him and at Clement and at the other hands and then at Maggie, who was still writing in her journal, and they left. When they were gone, Orville rode over to where Maggie sat her horse and looked at her for a moment. "You rode out here alone," he said. "I rode out here as a witness," she said, "which is different. It could have been dangerous. I did not go near them, and I had—" She opened the saddlebag at her side and showed him the pistol she had placed there. "I told you I was a reasonably good shot." He looked at the pistol and then at her face. His expression was complicated in the way that all the best emotions are complicated: relief and admiration, and something much warmer than either, pressing against the practical surface of his reserve. "What you wrote," he said. "Your witness account. Date, time, description of the individuals, description of what they did, approximate number of fence posts removed," she said. "I can write it out cleanly tonight. It should support whatever case you bring to the sheriff." He reached out and took her hand, the one that was holding the journal, and held it briefly in his large, work-roughened one. And it was not an elaborate gesture, just a moment of contact that said clearly what he did not yet have the words assembled for. And she felt it go through her like the shiver that precedes a storm. And she held very still and did not look away from him. And he held her gaze and then released her hand, and they rode back to the ranch together without speaking, which was, in its own way, a conversation. The Briggs matter was resolved over the following 3 weeks through the combination of the county sheriff, the certified land records, and Maggie's witness account, which was neatly written and specific enough to be genuinely useful. Harlan Briggs was fined for the fence damage, and the dispute over the creek frontage was settled definitively in the Double R's favor. And when the letter came from the county confirming this, Orville read it at the kitchen table and set it down and looked at Maggie and said, "Your journal made the difference." And the satisfaction in his voice was directed at her and not at the resolution of the matter, and she felt it land with a warmth that she was no longer trying to be practical about. The thing between them had been growing with the steady, undramatic sureness of something organic, rooted in the daily fabric of shared life, in meals and porch evenings and conversations that went longer than they had to, and silences that were more comfortable than most people's talk. There had been no declaration and no sudden revelation, only this slow, accumulating certainty, and it had reached the point where its unspoken nature had become its own kind of weight. It was Orville who addressed this in August, on a Sunday morning when the boys had gone to town, and the ranch was quiet, and the summer light was the dense gold of full season, and Maggie was in the garden with her hands in the earth as she often was. He came and stood at the garden fence, and she looked up and saw something in his face that made her go still. "I want to talk to you," he said. She stood up and came to the fence and leaned her arms on the top rail, and they were very close, the fence between them, both of them in the morning light. "I am not a man who is good with speech," he said. "I say less than I think because I never learned the knack of finding the exact right word quickly enough, so I generally wait until I am certain of what I mean before I say it. I want you to know that." "I know that," she said. "Then I want you to know that I have been certain of this for some time and have been waiting for the right moment, and I have decided there is no right moment and I should simply say what I know." He looked at her steadily. "I love you, Maggie. I did not expect to. I had convinced myself that this was not something that was going to happen to me again, and I was wrong, and I am glad to be wrong, because what I feel for you is the realest thing I have felt in a very long time." The garden was full of the sound of bees and the warm, growing smell of summer earth, and Maggie Keene looked at Orville Rourke over the fence with everything she felt visible in her face, because she had never been able to hide what she actually felt for very long, and she did not try now. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying to be sensible about it, and it has not been working." He opened the gate and came into the garden and stood in front of her and put one large, careful hand against her face, and she turned her cheek into it, and he leaned down and kissed her with the same quality that he brought to everything, unhurried, entirely present, completely sincere. And she kissed him back with everything she had been not saying for months. And the bees went on in the garden, and the summer light fell across the double R, and the wind moved through the dry grass in the way it always did. And the world did not stop, but it tilted slightly and settled in a new and better configuration. When Dax came back from town that afternoon and found his father on the porch with Maggie sitting in the chair beside him and his father's hand, holding her hand on the arm of the chair in a way that was entirely unlike anything Orville Rourke had done in his son's living memory, he stopped in the yard and looked at Clement, who had ridden in beside him, and Clement looked back at him, and they had a completely wordless exchange that contained all of the following. "I told you so, and I know, and I cannot believe it, and I can entirely believe it," and also a very large amount of simple, uncomplicated gladness. "Pa," Dax said carefully, walking toward the porch. "Dax," Orville said. "Clement and I got into town and back in good time," Dax said. "No trouble." "Good," Orville said. There was a moment of silence, and then Dax said, with the particular courage of a youngest son who has gotten away with most things, "Is there something you two want to tell us?" Orville looked at him with those gray eyes. "I intend to ask Maggie to marry me," he said, which was not something he had said aloud to Maggie yet, and she looked up at him quickly, and something warm and complicated moved across his face. "If she will have me, I thought my sons should know." Dax made a sound that was unambiguously joyful. Clement, more measured, looked at Maggie with a quiet, genuine warmth and said, "He is not easy, as I expect you know, but there is no better man." "I know that," Maggie said, and she did, all the way down. Orville Rourke proposed to Maggie Keene properly the following Sunday, on the porch in the evening, which was where so much that mattered between them had happened. And he did it with a simplicity and a directness that was entirely him. No elaborate speech, no theatrical gesture, just a ring that had belonged to his mother, a plain gold band that he had kept in the bottom of his dresser drawer for 23 years, and a question asked with the quiet certainty of a man who means every word. She said yes. She said it without hesitation, which told him something that the love he already knew she felt could not quite convey on its own, she was sure. She was choosing this the way she chose everything, deliberately and without reservation, with her eyes open and her whole self committed. They were married in October, when the heat had broken and the plains had gone gold and amber at the edges, and the sky was that particular autumn blue that seems deeper and more permanent than summer blue, as though it knows the cold is coming, and is making a final, excellent argument for itself. The reverend who usually presided over a largely empty church on Sunday mornings was startled and gratified by the attendance. Nearly half the town of Redemption Creek turned out for it, not merely from curiosity, but from the genuine warmth that the community had developed for Maggie over the months she had been at the Double R, which had made itself felt in small ways. In her advice to Mrs. Bauer about her youngest's cough, in the meals she had sent to the family of a hand who had broken his leg in the summer, in the simple, direct friendliness she extended to everyone she encountered, which was neither performative nor strategic, but simply the natural expression of a person who is interested in other people and acts accordingly. Orville, standing at the front of the church in his good black coat, watching Maggie walk down the aisle in a dress of deep green that she had made herself over the previous 3 weeks in the evenings after supper, felt a fullness in his chest that he had no particular vocabulary for, which was all right because he was not the kind of man who needed vocabulary for everything. Some things were sufficient in the feeling of them. Dax cried. He would later deny this entirely, but he did. Clement shook Orville's hand after the ceremony with a grip that said more than the formal words, and then he hugged Maggie briefly and told her she was very welcome in the family, and she told him she was already home. The winter at the Double R that year was the kind of winter that tests the fabric of everything hard and sustained, with storms that came out of the north, and kept the men close to the buildings for days at a stretch, and made the simple business of feeding and watering the cattle an exercise in endurance. It was a winter that under previous circumstances would have been a period of grim management and nothing more, but with Maggie in the house it became something different. She kept the stove burning and the meals excellent, and the house warm in the way that a house is warmed by more than fire. And in the long evenings when the wind screamed outside and the four of them were confined to the lamplight of the kitchen and the parlor, there were card games and reading aloud and conversations that ran longer and went deeper than the usual. And Orville found himself in the remarkable position of a man who is content, which was different from satisfied, and different from comfortable and entirely its own condition. He watched Maggie read to Dax from her Middlemark one evening when Dax's eyes were tired from a long day's work in poor light, and she read well, with an attention to the rhythm of the sentences that brought the prose alive, and Orville sat in the corner with his coffee and watched her and felt, with a clarity that required no analysis, that this was the life he had been building without knowing what he was building toward. In the spring, Maggie told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning in the kitchen, before the boys were up, sitting across the table from him with her coffee cup between her hands and her eyes very direct in the early light. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he got up and came around the table and took both her hands in his and looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of a man for whom happiness has arrived with a force that catches him entirely. "Are you all right?" he asked, because that was the first thing that mattered. "I am very well," she said. "I have checked. I am healthy and I know what to expect and I am not frightened." "Are you glad?" he asked. She smiled at him, and it was the full smile, the one that transformed her contained, capable face into something radiant. "I am very glad," she said. He held her hands for a long moment, and then he sat on the edge of the table, which was not a thing he usually did, and pulled her gently close and held her, and she leaned against him in the morning quiet of the kitchen, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the spring came through the window in the form of early light, and the sound of birds that had returned from wherever birds go in winter. When Dax heard the news that evening, he made more noise than the occasion probably strictly required. Clement sat very still for a moment, and then smiled in the slow way that was his most genuine expression, and said that was the best news the Double R had had in some years. The pregnancy proceeded through the spring and into summer, and Maggie managed it with the same practical composure that she brought to everything, continuing to run the house and the garden, and the accounts with adaptations where necessary, and Orville, who had thought he knew himself fairly well by this point in his life, discovered that he was capable of a degree of attentive, watchful concern for another person that he had not known was in him. He was not hovering, she would not have stood for hovering, but he was present and available, and he paid attention, and these things together constituted a kind of care that she felt clearly and returned in kind. They had a son. He arrived in November, in the manner of children everywhere, which is to say without particular regard for anyone's preparation or timing, and he arrived with the assistance of the doctor from Redemption Creek, and a competence and determination on Maggie's part that left Orville with a speechless admiration that lasted for days. They named him Thomas Keene Rourke, the Keene for her mother, and for the line that had produced this remarkable woman who had ridden into his life on a Tuesday morning with her dusty hat and her leather satchel and her perfectly level eyes. Thomas was, from his first hours, a large and opinionated infant with a great deal of dark auburn hair that was clearly his mother's, and a set of lungs that suggested a future in occupations involving volume. The night he was born, after Maggie was sleeping and the doctor had gone and Dax and Clement had eventually been persuaded to go to their own beds, Orville sat in the chair by the window in their room with Thomas in his arms, the baby asleep against his chest, tiny and absolute and perfect in the way that nothing else in the world is, and he looked at his wife sleeping in the lamplight, and at his son, and at the dark winter plains outside the window, and felt the particular gratitude of a man who has been given more than he expected and knows it. In the morning, Maggie woke to find Orville still in the chair with Thomas on his chest, both of them asleep. The lamp burned low, and she lay in the warm bed and looked at them for a long time with something in her chest that was too large and too complete for any ordinary word. Life on the Double R settled into a new rhythm after Thomas's arrival, the rhythm of a household with an infant overlaid on the rhythm of a working ranch, which produced a particular kind of organized chaos that required everyone to be flexible and resourceful. Dax proved himself surprisingly adept with infants, which surprised everyone including Dax. Clement built a cradle of considerable craftsmanship, working on it in the evenings over the preceding months, and presenting it with a self-consciousness that was touching in its rarity. The ranch hands, all of whom had developed a clear affection for Maggie over the preceding year, treated the new baby's existence with the particular reverence that working men extend to the children of people they respect. The following year brought growth of several kinds. The Double R's cattle operation expanded as Orville purchased an adjacent section of land from an estate sale, and the management of the expanded ranch required more hands and more careful organization than ever before. Maggie's role in this was not merely domestic. She had been keeping the ranch's accounts for over a year by this point, taking over from a system that had been perfectly functional but less organized than it could be, and the clarity and efficiency she brought to the books made a tangible difference to the operation's profitability. She had also, by this point, done something that she had not fully planned but that had happened in the way of things that grow from genuine need. She had become a resource for the women of Redemption Creek in ways that went beyond cooking and housekeeping. It was the medical knowledge that started it, the wound care and the remedies that had come to the attention of the community through the Double R's hands. And then it was the practical advice that she gave freely to anyone who asked, the knowledge of land records and accounts and preservation and medicine that she had accumulated over years of being the kind of person who pays attention and learns from what she sees. Women came to her, not formally, not as supplicants, but as neighbors, and she helped them as a neighbor helps, which is to say without performance or self-consciousness, simply because she could. Orville watched this develop with a quiet pride that he expressed in practical ways, making sure she had the time she needed, ensuring that the horse and buggy were available when she needed to get to town, never once suggesting that her time was better spent on domestic concerns. He had married a woman of considerable gifts, and he understood that containing those gifts to the walls of one house was not a thing he would ask of her, or that she would accept. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Maggie came to him with a proposal. There was a small building in Redemption Creek that had stood empty since the apothecary who had operated it left for Amarillo the previous winter, and she had been thinking about it. "I want to open a proper medical supplies and dry goods operation," she said. "Not to compete with Bauer. He would not appreciate it, and there is no need to. He does what he does well. But a place specifically for medical needs and for women's goods, things that women need and that are not always easy to find here. Supplies, herbs, medicine, proper bandaging, and also goods that are not available in Redemption Creek and have to be ordered from the catalog, managed and ordered properly." Orville looked at her across the supper table, Thomas asleep in his cradle in the next room, the evening light coming through the window. "That would take capital," he said. "I have been setting aside my wages since I came to work for you," she said. "I know it is not enough on its own, but combined with what you said last fall about the surplus from the cattle sale, you have been planning this for a while," he said. "I have been thinking about it since November," she admitted. "I wanted to be sure it was viable before I brought it to you." He looked at her steadily. "It is your money, Maggie, your wages, your savings. You do not need to bring it to me for permission." "I am not asking for permission," she said, with the slight lift of one brow that he had learned meant she was pleased with him but was not going to say so directly. "I am asking for your opinion. There is a difference." He smiled then, which was still 18 months into their marriage, an event that struck the people who witnessed it as remarkable. "My opinion," he said, "is that you should do it." The shop in Redemption Creek opened in the summer of 1880, and it did not have a dramatic name or an elaborate sign. Maggie simply had painted on the window Keene's Supplies and Remedies, using her maiden name partly from habit and partly because that was who she was in the community, and Orville never suggested otherwise. It became, within a year, one of the most useful establishments in Redemption Creek. Women came from the surrounding ranches and farms for the goods she carried, and the advice she gave freely alongside them, and the small room at the back that she used for medical consultations. She was not a doctor and said so clearly, but she knew a great deal and was honest about the limits of that knowledge, and about when the actual doctor was needed, was nearly always occupied on the days she was in town. She was in town 3 days a week, and at the ranch the other 4, and she balanced the two with the same practical grace she brought to everything. And Thomas came with her to the shop on most days, growing from a baby carried in a sling against her front to a toddler who investigated everything in the shop with great thoroughness, and then fell asleep under the counter in the afternoons. And she loved both parts of her life completely, and did not experience them as competing. The Briggs matter, resolved legally the previous year, stayed resolved. Harlan Briggs, faced with the legal clarity of the Double R's title and the county's ruling, had eventually concluded that conflict with Orville Rourke was unprofitable and had redirected his energies elsewhere. The two men were never friends, but they came to a working peace of the kind that is possible between men who respect each other's capacity for obstinance. In the fall of 1880, Dax Rourke fell in love with the schoolteacher who had come to Redemption Creek the previous spring, a young woman from Ohio named Clara Walsh, who was 22, and had the particular determination of a person who has decided to do something important with her life and will not be easily dissuaded from it. The courtship was enthusiastic on Dax's part and measured on Clara's, because Clara was not a woman who committed herself without being certain, and she took several months to become certain, during which Dax was patient in ways that demonstrated genuine growth of character. Maggie, who had taken to Clara from their first meeting, watched this unfold with enormous satisfaction, and told Orville that watching his son be completely and transparently devoted to someone was one of the finer things she had observed in the Texas Panhandle. Orville said that Dax had always had the capacity for it. He said it with the quiet, unostentatious pride of a father who knows his son's virtues and is glad to see them flower. Clara said yes to Dax in December, on the same porch where so much at the Double R seemed to happen, and the engagement was celebrated at the ranch with a supper that Maggie cooked for 14 people, because Dax had invited what appeared to be everyone he had ever met, and the table was extended into the parlor, and the evening was full of noise and warmth and laughter in a way that the house had not known in its quiet years, and that it absorbed now as if it had always known the possibility was there. Clement, characteristically, did not make a fuss about his own situation, which was one of quiet, ongoing courtship with a widow named Anna Pearson who had a small farm 10 miles east and 2 children, and a composure and strength that suited Clement the way a good tool suits a skilled hand. He had been seeing her for a year before he mentioned it to anyone, and when he did mention it to Orville, Orville simply nodded and said he was glad, and when he mentioned it to Maggie, she looked at him with a warmth that made his reserved face soften in the way it rarely did, and said she had been hoping he and Anna would find their way to each other for months. By the spring of 1881, the Double R had changed in ways that would have been entirely inconceivable to the Orville Rourke of 3 years earlier. The house that had been a functional and somewhat austere bachelor establishment was now thoroughly inhabited, full of the particular energy and noise, and accumulated warmth of a family that had grown in ways its patriarch had not designed or anticipated. Thomas was 2.5, walking with great confidence and talking with the determination of a child who has a great deal to communicate and is not going to let vocabulary limitations stop him. Dax and Clara had been married since February and lived in the new addition that Orville and Clement had built onto the main house over the winter, because Dax had no intention of going anywhere, and there was more than enough land and work to sustain them all. Clement and Anna were not yet married, but were understood to be heading there by everyone who knew them, and Anna's children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, had taken to the double R with the wholehearted enthusiasm of children who have not had very much and suddenly find themselves somewhere spacious and rich with possibility. And Maggie, who had come off a stagecoach on a Tuesday morning with a dusty hat and a leather satchel and a direct, unsentimental gaze, and who had done what she always said she would do, which was to be useful, to make a home, to be somewhere she was glad to be with people she was glad to know she was, by all the evidence available to her honest assessment, exactly where she had been without quite knowing she was looking for. She was at the kitchen table one April evening, working on the accounts for the shop, Thomas asleep upstairs, the sounds of Dax and Clara somewhere in the house, Orville reading in the armchair in the parlor doorway where he liked to be close to the lamp, when he looked up from his book and said, "Maggie." She looked up. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked it with the seriousness with which he asked everything, meaning it to be answered honestly. She put down her pen and looked at him across the kitchen, at this man who had been an unexpected country and had become her landscape. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "More than I thought possible," he said. "More than I deserve." "You deserve it exactly," she said firmly. He smiled at her. "You always know what you think, and I am usually right," she said. "You are usually right," he agreed, and went back to his book, and she went back to her accounts, and the lamp burned between them. And outside, the Texas Panhandle night was huge and starred, and the wind moved through the grass the way it always did, and the cattle were quiet in the dark pastures, and the double R stood as it had stood for 20 years, built to last, which it was doing. By the summer of 1881, there was another baby coming. Maggie told Orville on the porch as she had told him the first time, and he responded as he had responded the first time, with a silence that was not silence at all but attention concentrated into stillness, and then he took her hands. "Thomas will be beside himself," he said. "Thomas will attempt to take over," she agreed. "We should start preparing him for the concept of sharing." "Good luck," Orville said, because Thomas Rourke, while possessed of many virtues, had not yet demonstrated any natural tendency toward relinquishing things that were his. He was, in this respect, clearly his father's son. Clement married Anna Pearson in August, a quiet ceremony with only family present, which was what both of them wanted. Her children were at the wedding with the shy, cautious joy of children being welcomed into something, and Clement kneeled down to them afterward and said something to each of them in a voice too low for anyone else to hear, and whatever he said made them both smile with the kind of relief that is the child's version of certainty. Thomas managed the wedding with more energy than the occasion required, and Maggie held him on her hip for most of the ceremony, which was increasingly necessary given that she was 6 months along, and Thomas had strong opinions about being put down. Orville stood beside her and watched his older son get married, and his younger grandchildren, for Anna's children, were now fully his, a thing he had concluded within a week of understanding Clement's intentions. And the weight of all of it was not heavy but full, the way a good harvest is full, with the particular satisfaction of things that have come to fruition. The second baby arrived in October, as Thomas had arrived in November 2 years earlier, with competence and timing of its own choosing. This one came faster, and Maggie managed it with a pragmatic efficiency that left the doctor from Redemption Creek slightly awed, and the baby announced itself with the same volume and conviction as its older brother, which suggested strong opinions were a family trait. They had another son. Orville held him in the evening after the doctor had gone, and Thomas had been persuaded with great difficulty to go to sleep, and the house had finally quieted, and this son had his father's silver-gray coloring and Maggie's auburn tinge in his thin, dark hair, and he looked at Orville with the unfocused but absolute intensity of the newborn, as though he were committing to memory a face of considerable importance. "What do we call him?" Orville asked, because he had maintained throughout the pregnancy that the name should be Maggie's choice, as Thomas's name had contained her heritage, and this one should contain his, or something of both. "I thought," Maggie said from the bed, her voice tired but complete, "Samuel, for no particular literary reason, just because it is a good, solid name and it suits him." "Samuel," Orville said, and the baby responded to this with no particular acknowledgement, which was appropriate since he had only been in the world for about 2 hours. "Samuel Rourke." "Samuel James Rourke," she said. "James was your father's name, you told me." He looked at her. She had remembered that from a conversation they had had in the first winter, a conversation about families and origins that had been long and wandering, and apparently she had filed everything from it. "Yes," he said, "it was." She smiled at him from the pillow, exhausted and radiant and entirely herself. "Then that is what he should be called." He brought Samuel to her and sat on the edge of the bed, and they held the baby between them, this small, new, complete person, and Thomas asleep down the hall and Dax and Clara in the next part of the house and Clement and Anna and her children 10 miles east, and the whole life that had come from the Tuesday morning. A dusty, direct-eyed woman had stepped off a stagecoach and asked directions to the Double R in a general store. This whole enormous, unexpected, richly populated life. "You know," Orville said after a while, looking at Samuel's small, serious face. "What?" She said, "I told my sons more than once that no woman was going to—" He paused, choosing his words with care as he always did. "I had a settled position. I was certain of it." Maggie looked up at him with those gray-green eyes that still, after all this time, had the quality of seeing things clearly. "And now I understand that I was operating with incomplete information," he said. "I was defending against something I had not encountered. I had encountered women, many of them fine women, but I had not encountered you." "I did not tame you," she said with a slight smile. "No," he said, "you did not. You are not in the business of taming. What you do is something different." "What do I do?" she asked, genuinely curious. He thought about it for a moment, which was his way. "You see things as they are," he said. "You see me as I am without wanting me to be something else and without being diminished by what I am. And that," he paused again, "that made it possible, that made everything possible." She leaned her head against his shoulder carefully, not displacing Samuel, who was now asleep in the competent way of infants who have expended great effort and require recovery. "You are a good man, Orville Rourke," she said. "You are the best man I have ever known." He put his arm around her, careful and complete. "And you," he said, "are everything I did not know to look for." They sat like that in the lamplight of the October evening, the three of them, while the wind moved across the Texas Panhandle in the way it always had and always would, carrying the smell of grass and distance, and the particular clean scent of the high plains that neither of them would ever want to live without. And the Double R stood solid around them, built to last, built by a man who had understood what it meant to make something real, something durable, something worth keeping, and who had discovered, late and unexpectedly and with great gratitude, that the most real and durable and worth-keeping thing was not the land or the cattle or the careful stone and timber house, but the life lived in it and the person you chose to live it with. Thomas woke briefly in the middle of the night, and Orville went to him, lifting the boy from his bed with the ease of practice and carrying him to the window to look at the stars, which was what Thomas wanted when he woke in the dark, and Thomas said in his 2.5-year-old voice, "Baby Samuel." And Orville said, "Still sleeping?" And Thomas said, "Good," and went back to sleep in his father's arms, and Orville carried him back to his bed and stood there a moment in the dark room looking at his son. And then he went back down the hall to where Maggie slept and Samuel slept in the cradle that Clement had made. And he sat in the chair by the window and watched them both and the stars outside, and felt the still, deep satisfaction of a man who has built well and chosen well, and in the end been wiser than he knew, not because he had planned any of it, but because when the unexpected arrived on a Tuesday morning with clear eyes and a leather satchel, he had been enough of a man to recognize it and to let it in. The years that followed were good years. Not perfect, because no years are perfect, and the Texas Panhandle in the 1880s was a place of ongoing challenge, drought years and strong winters, and the particular business difficulties of a cattle operation in a changing market, and the political and social complications of a frontier settling into civilization, with all the friction that process contains. There were years when the grass was poor and the cattle prices were low and the margins were difficult, and years when the weather seemed to have a personal grudge, and there were harder things too, the passing of people they had known and cared for, the ordinary losses that time brings to any life lived long enough. But they weathered all of it with the particular resilience of two people who have chosen each other fully, and who face what comes as a unit, which is the most practical kind of love there is, and also the most enduring. Maggie's shop grew, and eventually she hired a woman to assist her on the days she was in town, a sensible arrangement that extended the shop's reach and gave work to someone who needed it. Orville expanded the Double R twice more in the decade, each expansion carefully considered and executed with the methodical competence that was his professional hallmark. Dax and Clara had 3 children in 4 years, all of them loud and joyful and completely at home on the ranch, and Dax grew from an engaging young man into a solid one, weathered by responsibility in ways that only deepened what was already good in him. Clement and Anna settled into the quiet, strong life that suited them, her children fully absorbed into the Double R family, growing up with Thomas and Samuel as though the particular bloodlines involved were entirely beside the point. Thomas grew up to be his father's shadow in the best sense, absorbing everything Orville knew about cattle and land, and whether with an appetite for learning that his mother recognized as her own reflected in a different temperament. He was serious and capable, and had his mother's habit of looking directly at things and her father's habit of speaking only when he had something worth saying, and the combination made him, even as a boy, someone that adults tended to take seriously. Samuel grew up to be his own person entirely, which is perhaps the most one can say, and the most anyone hopes for. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's directness, and a quality of imagination and humor that seemed to come from some fortunate convergence of both of them. And he filled the house with a particular energy that the more contained members of the family found sometimes exhausting and always necessary. In the spring of 1889, Orville and Maggie sat on the porch in the evening as they had sat so many hundreds of evenings, and the ranch spread out before them in the twilight, and the wind moved through the grass, and the sounds of children somewhere in the middle distance suggested that Thomas and Samuel were engaged in some project that would probably need adult assessment before it went much further. Maggie was reading. Orville had his pipe. The sky was the extraordinary color that the Texas Panhandle sky turns in the spring evenings, a deep amber fading into a blue so luminous it seemed almost interior, like a quality of mind rather than a quality of atmosphere. 11 years, Orville said. She looked up from her book. Tomorrow, she said, we married in October, it is still April. I am counting from Tuesday, he said, the Tuesday you arrived. She looked at him for a moment. He was 63, and the years had deepened the lines in his face and added more silver to what had already been silver, but his eyes were the same pale storm gray, and his presence was the same substantial, unhurried thing it had always been, and she felt the same quality of attention looking at him that she had felt looking at the house when she had first arrived, the recognition of something built to last. "That Tuesday," she said, "you were not pleased to see me." "I was not prepared," he said. "Which is different. You told your sons no woman would ever tame you," she said, because Dax had eventually told her the full history of the declaration, and she had found it both amusing and touching in the way that people's certainties often are when you can see past them to the humanity they were protecting. "I was right," he said. "No woman has tamed me." "What has happened then?" she asked. He looked out at the land and at the sky and at all of it, and then he looked at her. "I have been loved," he said. "Well, fully, as I am. And it has made me want to be better than I am, which is not taming, which is something altogether different and altogether better." She set her book down and reached across and took his hand, this large, work-worn hand that she knew as well as her own, better than her own, and held it. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly right." The wind moved through the grass and the stars were beginning at the edges of the sky, appearing one by one as they always did, as if remembering their positions after a long absence, and the double R settled into the evening, solid and enduring, full of life. From somewhere beyond the corral, Thomas's voice rose with a clarity that suggested the assessment of the project was required sooner rather than later. And Maggie laughed, and Orville stood up with the ease of a man still very much in his strength, and he kissed the top of her head as he passed her chair, and she watched him go with the fullness of everything she felt for him visible in her face, because she had never been able to hide what she actually felt for very long, and she did not try now. And had not for 11 years, and did not intend to start. This was the double R. This was what had grown from 4,000 acres of hard red dirt, and one man's ferocious, faithful attention to the work of building something worth keeping. And it had taken a woman arriving on a Tuesday, with a dusty hat and a leather satchel, and a pair of gray-green eyes that saw things exactly as they were, to show him that the most important building he had ever done was not the kind you measured in acres or timber or stone. It was the kind you measured in the mornings you woke glad to begin.